For centuries, the Rothschilds had been the unofficial leaders of banking, finance, and Jewish excellence worldwide. But then, another, more progressive Jewish family quietly came into the story, the Warburgs. Now, the Warburgs had been quietly building their own banking empire for over 400 years. But things exactly weren't smooth sailing for them. When World War I broke out, two brothers from the Warburg family ended up living on opposite sides of the Atlantic, and they were suddenly representing rival nations. On top of this, they'd become one of the very few prominent banking dynasties who were Jewish but openly opposed to Zionism. Despite all of this, the Warburgs managed to stay largely unknown and invisible. Chances are you probably haven't even heard of them. They challenged the Rothschild empire and revolutionized international finance forever. So buckle in. Today we're going to look into the bizarre story of the Warburgs. Now, our story starts in the early 1900s. Tensions were rising across the Western world. Beneath the surface of diplomacy and military planning, another contest was unfolding, one for financial dominance. At the heart of it stood two of Europe's most powerful banking dynasties, the Rothschilds and the Warburgs. Now, you're probably familiar with the name of Rothschild, but Warburg isn't that well known. You see, the Warburgs were one of the wealthiest Sephardic Jewish families in Germany. Their roots trace all the way back to Venice. But by the early 20th century, they became a central force in both Frankfurt and New York. Meanwhile, the Rothschilds held deep influence in London and Paris. For over a century, they helped shape European state finance. But by the early 1900s, two rising powers, who were Germany and the United States, started to challenge Britain's dominance. So you have one family, the Rothschilds, representing the old order of finance, and another, the Warburgs, representing the new challengers. And this was to set the stage for how the great powers reacted. You see, at the time, Britain controlled 1/4 of the world's commerce. It used its vast imperial network and credit to maintain global influence. British banks dominated trade finance, they set insurance terms, and they determined access to capital. Through the City of London, the British state could reward its allies and punish rival economies without ever firing a shot. Loans were withheld, currencies were pressured, and capital was made scarce or abundant depending on the political alignment. In this way, finance became an extension of foreign policy. But the world was changing. The financial panic of 1907 sent shockwaves across global markets. Now, for Germany and the United States, who were Britain's main commercial rivals, it was a wake-up call. They realized that without strong financial institutions of their own, they would always be vulnerable to British pressure. So both countries moved quickly to fortify their systems, and both sought the help of the Warburgs. Now, leading these efforts were two brothers, Max and Paul Warburg. Max advised the German government from Hamburg. He was a leading figure in German finance and the head of Warburg & Co., a foremost commercial bank in Germany. Now, through this bank, he played a central role in shaping the empire's economic strategy. He supported German economic imperialism and became one of the very few Jewish financiers with direct access to the German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II, whereas Paul Warburg operated on the other side of the Atlantic. Based in New York, Paul was a partner at Kuhn, Loeb & Co. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because I mentioned it in this video about Jacob Schiff. Now, Jacob Schiff and Paul Warburg weren't just partners. Schiff was his brother-in-law. Now, Paul pushed relentlessly for US monetary reform, which he saw as vital to preventing financial panics and modernizing the American economy. He was also one of the key architects and influential figures in what would later become the US Federal Reserve. Together, the Warburgs worked to build financial systems in Germany and America that would outcompete British dominance. And at this moment, they were totally in line with what the Rothschilds wanted. So together, they pushed for tighter central banking structures, greater government coordination with industry, and transatlantic financial cooperation. But this kind of cooperation could not last forever. Paul Warburg needed to get the US ready to compete with the dominant British. You see, to Paul, the United States was a financial giant with a very fragile skeleton. They were very rich in resources and industry, but they severely lacked in institutional machinery needed to manage modern finance. You see, Paul was trained in the disciplined world of European banking, and the American system felt primitive and backwards to him. He was shocked by the absence of a central bank and appalled by the disorganized patchwork of local institutions that governed credit and currency. I mean, at this rate, America would never displace Great Britain as a financial power. So he began a personal crusade to modernize US finance. He wrote articles, he gave speeches, he even pushed for reform in elite banking circles. His core idea was simple: America needed a central bank, one that could stabilize the currency, regulate credit, and serve as a last resort lender in times of crisis. Now, everything I'm saying here is backed up by sources. The sources are all numbered across the video, and there's a central document that's linked in the description that gives you all of my resources and research in case you want to dive deeper. So as I was saying, Paul Warburg wanted to modernize US finance, and this would give them a deeper strategic purpose, and that would be to strengthen America's position in the international financial order. He envisioned a structure that could defend itself against disruptive gold flows, absorb external shocks, and eventually rival the power of the City of London. Now, he probably had an ulterior motive as well, because by doing all of this, he would be able to replace the Rothschilds as the voice of the global Jewish diaspora. You see, he understood one thing very clearly, and that was influence over monetary policy was also influence over national destiny. In 1910, Paul Warburg joined a secret meeting at Jekyll Island in Georgia. He was joined by Senator Nelson Aldrich and a handful of other financiers, and he helped draft the outline of what would become known as the Aldrich Plan, the blueprint for a central banking system. Now, despite all the wealth and power in that room, it took more than 3 years for a Federal Reserve Act to become law that would eventually create the Federal Reserve System. Now, while Paul was pushing for reform in the United States, his brother, Max, was drawing similar lessons in Germany, but acting on them in a different way. You see, in the aftermath of the 1907 panic, Max also recognized the very same vulnerabilities in the global system. But instead of advocating for institutional reform alone, he focused on strategy, especially how Germany could shield itself from British financial dominance. With the help of Paul, he pushed for closer economic ties between Germany and the United States. He believed that a stronger cooperation between these two rising powers could serve as a counterbalance to Britain's financial overreach. By 1914, the Warburg brothers had received extraordinary financial influence on both sides of the Atlantic. However, Europe inched closer to war as time went on, and their positions quickly became increasingly fraught. Despite their shared vision for a transatlantic cooperation, Max and Paul now found themselves serving governments that were quickly becoming enemies. Max Warburg continued advising the German Empire. His role in German finance was as much political as it was economic. He moved within the Kaiser's inner circle and remained a key proponent of German financial independence from British influence. But Paul Warburg faced much more resistance. You see, many in the US political establishment were deeply suspicious of centralized banking. It didn't help either that he was a European-born banker with links to international finance. Paul's German heritage and ties to Kuhn, Loeb & Co. became a target for political hostility and conspiracy-laced criticism. Despite all of this, he found a strong ally in President Woodrow Wilson. He understood Warburg's importance. In the summer of 1914, Wilson nominated him to serve on the first Federal Reserve Board. Despite vocal opposition, Paul was confirmed and officially sworn in on August 10, 1914. This was just days after the start of World War I. So now you had Paul Warburg entering public service, while on the other side of the ocean, his brother Max served the German Empire. Paul used his influence to resist American aid to Britain and its allies. He made the argument that doing so would bring an industrial depression to the United States, should the war end too quickly. Now, if you think about it, this might have been influenced by his relation to Jacob Schiff. A longer war could cripple everyone involved if access to finance was not secured, just as Russia had found out in their war against Japan. But by 1917, everything the Warburg brothers had worked on was starting to fall apart. For years, they championed the idea that finance could bind nations together, that rational cooperation would triumph over petty politics. But the German leadership was about to frustrate them immensely. In Berlin, Max Warburg could only watch with disappointment as military leaders pushed for what can only amount to strategic suicide. Previously, the German Navy was under strict orders to avoid sinking neutral boats, for example those that were supplying the British from the US. Faced with a prolonged stalemate and growing desperation, the German Navy convinced Kaiser Wilhelm II and the top brass that resuming unrestricted submarine warfare was the answer. They promised victory within 5 months, but saner voices tried to intervene. Even Germany's own chancellor, their political leader essentially, strongly opposed the move. They warned that attacking American ships would almost certainly drag the United States into the war. But the chancellor, Max, and many others were just ignored. The military were using their overwhelming influence to take over control of German strategy. Diplomacy and common sense were thrown out the window. Meanwhile, across the pond in Washington, Paul Warburg found himself in an impossible situation of his own. Remember how he literally helped to build the US financial reserve? Well, he tried to keep the financial relationship between the US and Germany intact. He even tried to endure political backlash for being too German. But now the Germans were sinking American ships and killing American citizens. The pressure was way too great, so President Wilson had no choice but to respond. Even then, the president had left the door open. He offered Germany a way out. He promised negotiations if the submarine attacks just stopped. But Berlin doubled down, and they even tried to get Mexico into the war against the US. Throughout February and March, the US ships kept going down. American seamen died, and the American public was furious. Rightly so. By April, the US was properly at war, and Germany's fate was sealed. Now, while Germany lost, Paul and Max Warburg didn't. They moved quickly to consolidate their influence in the new order. Paul stepped down from the Federal Reserve Board in 1918, but he stayed close to the institution that he helped build. From 1921 to 26, he served on the Federal Advisory Council, offering quiet guidance as the US took its place as a global financial leader. At the same time, he returned to private businesses and turned his attention to the wreckage left behind in Europe. Paul launched the International Acceptance Bank. His goal was simple but urgent: to channel American capital into post-war European reconstruction, most importantly in Germany. He wanted to stabilize economies, rebuild trust, and prevent another collapse. And once again, he did it in coordination with his brother Max, who was still working from within Germany. Now, Max faced a very different landscape. You see, Germany in the 1920s was spiraling into economic chaos. Inflation raged out of control, the mark collapsed, and savings vanished overnight. In the middle of this disaster, the Warburg family bank stepped in with a radical new idea: to circulate foreign currencies inside Germany. This gave businesses and individuals a temporary lifeline against the worthless national currency. It was an emergency workaround, but it worked, and it helped a total economic breakdown. Now, this improvised solution would go on to shape global finance for decades to come. The Eurobond market emerged in the 1960s. In many ways, it's an extension of the cross-border, cooperative financial thinking that the family had championed since the early 20th century. Now, in the US, Paul had used his reputation to open doors for his own family as well. He introduced Max to powerful financial circles in New York, a move that proved crucial when Germany desperately needed capital during the economic crisis of 1930 to 1932. When other investors hesitated, Paul's connections and quiet credibility gave Germany some breathing room, at least for a little while. Even as they helped rebuild Europe's financial systems, the Warburgs found themselves fighting on more than one front. Despite their quiet role in stabilizing the economy, Germany faced severe backlash. National humiliation after Versailles and rising political extremism created the perfect climate for scapegoating, and the Warburg name became the perfect target. They were Jewish, wealthy, and visibly tied to the old establishment. Now, members of the Warburg family and their partners were now sitting on the boards of over 100 German corporations. In the eyes of rising nationalists and anti-Semitic voices, they represented everything that had supposedly gone wrong with the old order. What's ironic is that the biggest voices against the Warburgs were often the same people who led Germany to ruin in the first place: former military officers, nationalist politicians, and reactionary aristocrats. In a way, you can say that they scapegoated the Warburgs to deflect the blame away from themselves. But the family challenges weren't limited to the far right. You see, inside the Jewish community itself, the Warburgs were engaged in another quiet ideological battle. This time, it was the Zionist movement, which the Rothschilds had heavily supported. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, the Warburgs heavily pushed back against the growing momentum for a Jewish state in Palestine. They believed that the answer to Jewish persecution was not to create a separate homeland. Instead, it was to integrate and normalize Jewish life within Western democracies. In their view, Zionism would only deepen the divide between Jewish people and non-Jewish people, further risking violence, especially in the Middle East. And they put their money where their values were. Instead of funding Zionist resettlement in Palestine, they financed agricultural colonies for Jews in Russia and Ukraine, and this infuriated Zionist leaders. To the Warburgs, it was a matter of principle. They wanted Jews to be treated as full citizens in their respective countries, not as outsiders waiting to return to a distant homeland. To many, this made the Warburgs seem out of step with the mood at the time, but many others saw them as brave. They were battling anti-Semitism on one side and ideological pressure from within their own communities on the other side. All the while, they were still trying to protect the global financial system that they helped to protect and build. They had influence in this new order, but they had no safe ground, not in Berlin, not in New York, not in Jerusalem. But as the 1930s unfolded, the Warburgs saw their vision of peaceful existence to be nothing more than wishful thinking. The rise of the Nazi Party made that painfully clear. The Nazis didn't hesitate to weaponize divisions within Germany's Jewish community. The long-standing identity conflict between Zionists, assimilationists, and traditionalists became a tool in Nazi propaganda. That fractured response made it harder for Jewish people to organize, defend themselves, and even present a united front. The Warburgs tried to stand their ground. Even as Hitler rose to power in 1933, they insisted that they were as good Germans as anyone else. After helping rebuild a post-war economy and protect German financial stability, Max Warburg believed that he would be safe. After all, he was respected, connected, and he still had sway in banking circles. But the reality on the ground was very different. The Nazis began systematically targeting Jewish businesses and institutions. Remember Warburg & Co.? Well, that was slowly Aryanized. Its assets were handed over to non-Jewish Germans in pieces. By the mid-1930s, much of the bank's day-to-day work revolved around helping fellow Jews liquidate their assets and escape the country. Still, Max held on. As late as 1937, he gave a toast at a bar mitzvah saying, "Always remember, you are a German." Now, you cannot help but think it was a heartbreaking moment of denial and loyalty for a man clinging on to the idea of a country that no longer even tolerated the existence of people like him. Eventually, the pressure proved too much. In August 1938, Max Warburg left Germany for New York. He had waited for as long as he could. Too long, probably, because just a year later, war would break out. Now, by this time, Max and Paul Warburg were old men. The world that they had tried to stabilize through finance had erupted once again into chaos, now on an even more catastrophic scale. Now, even though their direct influence had faded, the family that they built and the financial empire that they shaped were far from finished. In America, Paul's son, who was James Paul Warburg, stepped into public life. He was a banker and an economist in his own right, and he joined President Roosevelt's original brain trust. He advised the administration on financial matters during one of the country's most turbulent eras, the Great Depression. He carried his father's belief that finance and policy could work hand in hand. Now, back in Germany, things took a darker turn as the Nazi government began to outright annihilate the Jewish population. Now, however, the Warburgs survived the war remarkably intact. Ever since Hitler came to power in 1933, the family had already begun transferring their assets, influence, and people to safer ground. But what came next was pretty remarkable. In 1944, Paul's nephew, Erich Warburg, returned to Germany, but not as a banker. Instead, he returned as a US Air Force officer. He served as the chief interrogator for none other than Hermann Göring, one of the highest-ranking Nazis. It was a symbolic reversal of power. But it didn't end there. Erich also negotiated with the Allied authorities to allow the family's former Hamburg-based firm to resume operations. With astonishing speed, the Warburgs re-established themselves as the center of financial training and influence. Almost overnight, young bankers from across Europe would come to work in their firm. They would go on to hold directorships in dozens of major German corporations. By the time Paul Warburg had passed away, the estate he left behind was pretty substantial. It's estimated by some bankers that it could be anywhere between 50 million and 100 million. If you take that higher estimate, his net worth today would probably be around $3.5 billion. But the true value of his legacy wasn't in money. It was the fact that his family had endured and rebuilt. Paul and Max had managed to guide their family through wars, economic crisis. They watched the nations that they worked for go to war with each other. They saw their life's work nearly wiped out. Twice. Unlike the Rothschilds or the Barings, the Warburgs managed something rare in the aftermath of the two world wars. They regained their footing in their historical homeland. Today, the Warburg name lives on in the very structure of modern finance. Their institutions in both Europe and the United States are privately owned and deliberately low profile, just the way that the family prefers it. In Germany, the legacy continues through the Warburg Group. It's a tightly held banking firm that's headquartered in Hamburg. The bank remains under private ownership, and some may say that this was a strategic direction. After witnessing what state interference and populist rage can do, the Warburgs chose to keep a close control and their visibility pretty low. Now, in the Atlantic, the American legacy lives through Warburg Pincus LLC. It's one of the world's most powerful private equity firms. Since its founding, it had invested over $90 billion in more than 930 companies across 40 countries. Their presence today spans almost every major financial hub, from New York, London, Frankfurt, Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Sao Paulo. The global footprint is not built on branding, but on decades of quiet competence. In that sense, the Warburgs follow the example of the Swedish Wallenbergs, wielding enormous influence from behind the curtain. No bold statements, no family foundations emblazoned with their name, just disciplined stewardship of capital, networks, and legacy. In a way, they embodied the age-old principle of true influence, and that is, real power is invisible. After a century of revolutions, war, persecution, and reinvention, the Warburgs chose subtlety over spectacle, and in doing so, they've remained what they've always been, which is deeply embedded, rarely seen, and quietly essential to the machinery of global finance. Now, if you've made it this far, let's change things up with the emoji. Try a light bulb in the comments to let me know that you've made it this far. Also, check out this video that I made about another low-profile dynasty called the Wallenbergs. I think you'll really enjoy it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video if you've enjoyed it, and also hit that bell icon because it notifies you when a new video drops. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.